At the turn of the 20th century, America was a land of limitless possibility. The skyline rose with steel and ambition, bold, daring, and unstoppable. Fueled by the American dream, small-town entrepreneurs built companies that reshaped industries and uplifted their communities. Innovation became the heartbeat of our nation. In 1912, local business leaders united with a shared purpose: to create a single voice dedicated to defending free enterprise, empowering businesses to serve people, provide solutions, and strengthen society. That voice became the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, committed to advancing economic freedom and opportunity for every American. For over a century, we've been a driving force at the crossroads of progress, shattering barriers, fueling growth, and creating opportunities for people building better lives. We don't just support business, we ignite it. From local startups to global enterprises, we create an environment where potential thrives, empowering communities, leaders, and creators to transform bold ideas into lasting impact. Working with and for a local, national, and global federation of partners, we fight for American businesses in the courts, in state capitals, in Washington, and on the world stage. Steadfast in our principles, unwavering in our resolve, uncompromising in doing what's right. This is America's story, written with vision, bound by conviction, illustrated through courage, and enriched by the hard work of everyday people, local business owners, and global visionaries who continue to define us. It's an enduring legacy of strength, determination, and shared ambition. One we proudly build upon as we work to write the next chapter of our nation's story. Join us. Together, let's build a future of growth and opportunity for the pursuit.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Free Enterprise Exchange. Now, as we just saw in the video, defending, protecting, and advancing free enterprise is the U.S. Chamber's 114-year mission, and that mission has taken on new urgency for us and our allies today. We created this platform to address common myths, explore emerging trends, and provide timely insights that will help all of us promote and uphold the values of the free enterprise system. Today, we're going to delve into the debate over the role of government in shaping markets during this new era of industrial growth. We'll hear from two of the brightest minds on these topics, with Neil Bradley, the Chamber's Chief Policy Officer and Head of Strategic Advocacy, leading a conversation with Dr. Michael Strain. Now, Michael, as you probably know, is Director of Economic Policy Studies and the Arthur F. Burns Scholar in Political Economy at the American Enterprise Institute. He's published dozens of articles in leading academic and policy journals, and you've probably seen him quoted in major national publications or seen him on CNBC. Michael is also professor of practice at Georgetown's McCourt School of Public Policy. And if you haven't read it yet, be sure to pick up his book, The American Dream is Not Dead, but Populism Could Kill It. Now, this is intended to be a conversation, and as it gets underway, we want to hear your questions. So if you're watching this using Swoogo, you can submit your questions in the form that's right under the video. If you're joining us via YouTube, you'll find a link in the description box that's helpfully labeled Submit a Question. Just click that link and share your thoughts with us. We'll hear from Michael and Neil for a little while first, and then we'll get into audience questions a little later in the program. So with that, let me turn things over to Neil and Michael.
Courtney, thank you so much. Michael, thanks for joining us today. It seems like a pretty timely opportunity to discuss industrial policy.
Yes, it is. And thank you for having me. And Neil, at the outset, let me thank you and Courtney and all your colleagues at the Chamber for all you're doing to advance prosperity in the United States. A goal of a more prosperous nation is one that we should all share. And it's hard to think of an institution more important in the fight for prosperity than the U.S. Chamber. So I'm grateful for all you do and happy to be here.
Well, thank you. Back at you to the American Enterprise Institute. Likewise, for a century, you guys have been leaders on economic freedom, national security issues, and just the core elements of our democracy. And of course, that is intertwined with capitalism, or our democratic capitalist system. And you recently wrote, maybe a year or so ago, about one of the threats to democratic capitalism, and that was industrial policy. I'm curious before we get into why it's a threat, maybe you can actually help define for our audience what exactly is industrial policy?
Yes, it's a good question. It's a term that's often used and seldom defined. I think of it, I prefer kind of a very simple, clear definition, which is the government intervening in the free market in order to support a politically favored industry. And I think that definition kind of captures the essence of industrial policy in a neutral way. That, I mean, maybe this is a good thing. I don't think anybody would have argued with the United States decision in the Second World War to engage in industrial policy. We needed to build a military, but I think there are times when it's a bad thing as well.
Well, I want to come back to the idea of when it's bad and when it's good, because I think you're exactly right. It's not, as the World War II example, or even more recent examples, it's not always a bad idea to have industrial policy. But let's spend a moment on what those interventions can look like. So the government has lots of ways that it can kind of intervene in the marketplace, or intervene on behalf of either specific industries, or often even very specific companies. Share with us a little bit about what those interventions can look like.
Yeah, they definitely look they can look different, as you say. And so I think if you look at our last two presidents, President Trump and President Biden, both favored industrial policy, but they favor advancing politically favored industries in different ways. President Biden really preferred to use subsidies. And that was clear in the Inflation Reduction Act. It was clear in the CHIPS Act, providing tax credits or providing direct support to the clean energy industry, to the semiconductor industry, to other manufacturing firms. President Trump really favors using tariffs. As a way to bolster domestic manufacturing, and as a way to support politically favored industries. Both tariffs and subsidies are efforts to change relative prices, and so there's a deep connection between the two, but statutorily, through their legal mechanisms and the way they're understood by the public, they're quite different. Another way to do it is to just kind of dump a bunch of money on a specific industry. And a good example of that, I think, is Operation Warp Speed, which President Trump put in place during the coronavirus pandemic. So there are a lot of ways to do it, but typically it's loans or loan guarantees or grants is one big bucket. Tariffs is another big bucket. Subsidies are another big bucket.
Yeah, so you could kind of think of it as protecting, using the power of government to protect a company or industry, or using the power of government to collect money from taxpayers and then subsidize that company or industry. You've mentioned Operation Warp Speed, which I think we're going to find out in a minute. We both agree was a pretty good thing to occur, and I think everyone's going to agree that the industrialization in World War II was a good thing. Let's spend a moment talking about those examples of why it can be a good thing, because that will help us distinguish when it's a bad thing and what that looks like and why. So, why does it occasionally make sense to have kind of some form of government intervention into what would otherwise be the market deciding how fast we end up with a COVID vaccine or how fast we make warplanes?
Yeah, I think Operation Warp Speed. I think we definitely agree it was a great program, and I suspect it will be remembered as the years and decades roll on kind of a gold standard example of what a good industrial policy looks like. Warp Speed was an effort to develop a COVID-19 vaccine and to develop COVID-19 therapeutics. It cost around $18 billion. And the return to the taxpayer on that 18 billion was just enormous. Just enormous. Being able to return to normal life faster, being able to avoid adverse health consequences, being able to get businesses back up and running. I mean so one important attribute of good industrial policy is that it succeed. And Operation Warp Speed, I think will be remembered as just a huge success. I think a second important attribute is that the policy have clearly defined goals, and Warp Speed did. We need a COVID vaccine. We need therapeutics. That's a clear goal. If you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, in contrast, it's hard to really know what the goal of that is. I mean, is the goal to revitalize domestic manufacturing? Is the goal to fight climate change? Is the goal to develop new green energies? Is the goal some sort of effort to support national security? It's kind of hard to say. But Warp Speed, we knew what the goal was. Because the goal was clear, we weren't trying to balance competing goals, which I think is an effort that's hobbled some of the Trump and Biden programs. I think another important attribute is that before the program went into effect, it was reasonable to suppose that it would be successful. The U.S. has a great pharmaceutical industry. The world's leading pharmaceutical companies are here in the United States. We know what vaccines are. We have vaccine technology. All of this was in place ahead of time, and so I think that's another important feature of good industrial policy is the ability to just kind of pass the smell test before billions and billions of taxpayer dollars go out the door. And then I think another really important attribute of successful industrial policy is that it be bipartisan. And the reason for that is that a lot of industrial policy ambitions extend beyond a 2-year or 4-year time horizon. And we're seeing that with the Inflation Reduction Act. The Inflation Reduction Act is likely going to be remembered as a failure. And supporters of the IRA are going to point to the fact that the Trump administration and the U.S. Congress dismantled a lot of it, obstructed its effective execution. And there's a case to be made for that. But I would argue that if your industrial policy program is being measured in decades, we're going to start this today and it's going to bear fruit 10 years from now, and 20 or 30 years from now, we're going to be in a different and better place because of it. That may be fine, but if that's how long it's going to take for success to occur, you need to convince at least some members of the other party to get on board with your program. And if you don't do that, then the next president could come along, or the next Congress could come along and set different priorities. And when these programs with multi-decade shelf lives become partisan political footballs, that's obviously a recipe for failure. So those are some thoughts about what makes a successful program.
Yeah, I take your point about the idea if it's running decades, it needs to have bipartisan support. Probably true, and if it's a short term. But it's interesting. We're in total agreement on Operation Warp Speed and World War II, and these are good examples. They had clear goals, but they were also pretty short in duration, right? They were achievable objectives, well defined. It wasn't a permanent or quasi-permanent, intervention that no one knew when would ever come to it. We knew the war would end, and we had a goal of winning it and ending it as fast as possible. And we knew we were going to get to a vaccine, and we just wanted to get to it as fast as possible. And that's really, really different. It seems to me, and switching gears to talk about when an industrial policy goes wrong and some of the downsides on it, when it's not well defined, when it's kind of open-ended, you can have these kind of pervasive interventions into the market and kind of a lot of temptation. So maybe let's do the opposite of what we just did of when it goes right. What does it look like when it goes bad? And then let's talk a little bit about maybe some of the temptations to make it go bad.
Yeah, I mean, so I would, I would argue that the Inflation Reduction Act is an example of government doing industrial policy poorly. I think, as I mentioned, the goals were not clearly defined. What are we doing here? Are we trying to weaken our economic ties with China? Are we trying to build up national security? Are we trying to build a clean tech sector? Are we trying to revitalize U.S. manufacturing employment? Are we trying to fight climate change? I mean, it's not at all clear what the goal was, or even what the top two goals were, or something like that. Second, it's not, at least in my judgment, it was not at all clear at the time that success was a possibility. Do we have the workforce we need in order to build up this industry? Will subsidies to green tech firms revitalize manufacturing employment, and shift the composition of employment more in favor of manufacturing? It was not at all clear that was achievable even before the program went into effect. Will this program mitigate the effects of climate change or slow the pace of climate change? How do we know? How do we know when enough is enough? And so I think those are important considerations. There were competing goals, and that's part of the problem when you have all of these goals. And so, we saw, for example, the Biden administration enact enormous tariffs on imports of Chinese electric vehicles. When you talk to people who are concerned about climate change, the adoption of Chinese electric vehicles is often something they point to pretty early on as something we could do to help climate change. Well, but that goal was in conflict with the goal of weakening ties to China, with the goal of bolstering employment in the U.S. auto sector that the administration also had. We saw something similar with the CHIPS Act, where the Biden administration was insistent that a bunch of social policy goals around childcare provision and things of this nature be part of the execution of the CHIPS Act. That really slows down the ability to actually build out these fabs, and so you've got these competing goals that just weren't present with Warp Speed.
Well, I want to stick on that one for a second, if we can, because that seems to me to be a great illustration of some of the dangers of industrial policy, even when there might be a good intent and kind of bipartisan. So there was a great healthy debate about the need to have domestic capacity for semiconductors, right, for national security reasons, not to manufacture every chip in the U.S. I don't think anyone is really advocating for that, or maybe very few people. Like the chip that goes into our coffee maker, we don't really care. But having the ability to produce chips for missiles and fighter jets and national security things made sense. But even when the federal government got in and was doing that, when it came to implementation, once federal money was tied to it, it became the opportunity to say, well, you should also do these 5 other good things that we think companies ought to do.
Yeah.
And that seems to be some of the inherent risk when the government intervenes in the market, is that it has a hard time knowing when to stop and when not to kind of keep applying conditions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's absolutely right. So sometimes the contradictions come from within the program, like they did with the IRA, sometimes with the CHIPS Act. It's just, the program being embedded in this uh, uh, broader administration priorities around social policy provision and like childcare and things like that, really can really cause problems.
Which
One
hurts efficiency. You use the word efficiency, right? Like one of the things that we love about markets is they're generally efficient, and they punish companies and who aren't um, uh, uh, meeting demands, who aren't responsive to customers, who can't figure out ways to invent new things, who aren't efficient. And you've written a fair amount about this, industrial policy actually protects companies or industries from those things. They no longer have to be efficient. They can be encouraged to be inefficient,
Yeah.
and then be protected in their inefficiency. They could be protected from their lack of innovation by the very industrial policy. Is that one of the downsides of kind of government interventions, and what does that do to the kind of the economy overall?
Yeah, I think so. And I would underline the point you made about kind of being encouraged to be inefficient. Right now, uh, big companies and small companies all throughout the United States are having to spend a whole bunch of time and energy and money figuring out how to manage the trade war. And the trade war is an example, I think, of industrial policy. Um, the wrong thing for most companies, large or small, to do is to just ignore this. I mean, that would be a really bad business decision. But instead of spending time figuring out how to lower costs or how to increase sales, how to build their products or provide their services more efficiently and improve upon them, all the things we want businesses to be doing and that businesses want to be doing. Instead, they're having to divert a whole bunch of time and resources and money to figuring out, how to manage their business in light of President Trump's trade war. And so that's I think the government encouraging inefficiency. And I think we see something similar when industrial policy is done using subsidies. The goal in that case is to acquire the subsidy. Um, and the goal is not to pass the market test. The goal is to pass the tests being applied by the appropriators and government regulators. And so that does lead companies to being less hungry to do a better job as judged by market outcomes. Another thing that can happen is that companies are become insulated from market forces when a big source of their revenue is government subsidies, and that can work for a time, but when the subsidies are taken away, all of a sudden they find that other U.S. companies that didn't receive those subsidies, or certainly international competitors, just have an edge on them because they've been keeping up with market developments and responding to market signals instead of trying to keep up with regulatory developments and responding to the signals that are being sent by appropriators and regulators.
And if we think about US growth versus the rest of the world in recent decades, a lot of other countries decided that they were going to have industries or even companies that they were going to make national champions, that, we're going to use the power of the state to protect this industry from foreign competition or protect this company. It turns out that American companies, when we haven't been practicing industrial policy, are generally eating those other countries and companies' lunch
Oh yeah.
because they're protected and we're hungry. And so it's almost been one of the great competitive advantages of the United States that we didn't historically practice industrial policy.
Yeah, I think that's completely correct, and it's a good way to look at it. I mean, we often talk about um, the benefit of American economic dynamism as an explanation for our international competitiveness, and we talk about the degree to which U.S. markets are flexible and free as an explanation for our international competitiveness. And I think those are correct. But another way to say the same thing, at least in part, is to say that we don't have the government picking winners and losers. We don't have the government anointing national champions. We don't have companies spending a whole bunch of time trying to figure out how to attract the most government subsidy they can get, which frees up time to try to figure out how they can grab the biggest market share in their market.
Yeah, and thinking back, over our lifetimes, you can imagine moments where it would have been really easy for government to do that, right? So, Sears, the dominant retailer, when I was born, it was hard to imagine a world without Sears.
Yeah.
And you could see government saying we have to protect Sears. Turns out we didn't have to protect Sears. Turns out we've got lots of other retailers, and it's worked out just fine. Or,
Yeah,
you know,
absolutely. I think if you had talked to a lot of families back in the 1980s, and asked them, could you imagine life without the Sears catalog? They would have said no. And it would have been tempting, as you say, for the government. Well, hey, we have to have the Sears catalog. That's just, the way that a lot of families, make it through the month. And turns out we didn't need that. And thank goodness that we didn't try to freeze time in the year 1986.
right, exactly. I have one more area I want to get into, and then I want to get into our audience questions. And just a reminder, we have a number of them coming in. You can use the button at the bottom of your screen. Please do submit your questions. We are about to turn to those. But I think there's another area that's worth us spending a few minutes exploring. And we've generally been talking about industrial policy in kind of the context of subsidies or protection, the tariffs, the direct grants. But there's also another element of it that we're starting to hear more about that's pretty foreign in kind of the US history. And that is actually the government taking a stake in companies. We
Yes.
recently had the example of the government getting a quote golden share in the new Nippon US Steel arrangement. There's just recently concluded a transaction where the Department of Defense has taken ownership in a magnetics company. Talk a little bit about what that looks like, and what the potential is in terms of dangers when the government actually becomes an owner of market participants.
Yeah, I think it's just extremely troubling, and we should be asking some very important and fundamental questions about this development. And I'm glad you brought it up because it really is kind of under the radar. It's not something that Congress is talking about, or really that you're hearing a lot about in the public debate. Um, it would have been one thing for the Department of Defense to enter into a 10-year contract with that magnetics company. Um, but to take an ownership stake in it is really, I think, just a very different thing. And the same thing with Nippon Steel, the golden share in Nippon Steel. I think it's almost hard to know where to begin in offering criticisms of this. The I guess the first question really should be, why is this necessary? And in a free society, the government should have a reason to do something. And so the burden of someone, the Secretary of Defense might say to me, well, why isn't it necessary? And that's, the burden is on the government to demonstrate why they chose to do something. Where's Congress? Uh, uh, in our constitutional system, Congress decides what we spend money on. Where Congress appropriated this kind of slush fund, but to the DoD, but where's Congress? Has Congress approved the U.S. owning companies? Is Congress okay with the golden share? I think that's a very important consideration.
Well, one of the
Um,
things I think about too is think about other companies in that industry. We love competition, between two companies in the same industry, but all of a sudden, I suspect it will feel different if you're competing with another company who part of the ownership stake is the federal government. You're effectively competing with both a company and potentially the government, and it creates a whole lot of kind of perverse situations in which the government might want to protect the thing that it has now invested its money in. And
Yeah. And what happens if things go poorly for that company? Well, the government owns it. Is the government going to want to keep writing checks to a company that's performing poorly? And so it just raises all sorts of really fundamental questions.
And it feels like this is an important conversation to begin thinking about those guardrails because in dangers, maybe it's not even guardrails, maybe it's just things that we should try to avoid in a kind of a democratic capitalist free market society, because we do have these kind of emerging ideas around government's creation of a sovereign wealth fund, and leave aside where we would get the money. We don't have surpluses, we have a massive debt, but the reason the question, are we really going to have the government like just buying shares of companies? Are they going to, become the major shareholder in a publicly traded company? That feels very scary. It's just, I think that is the word I would use.
Yeah, the sovereign wealth fund, I agree, raises very similar issues, and unlike the golden share in Nippon or the stake of the Magnetics company, those have happened, but the sovereign wealth fund hasn't happened yet. But you're right to ask those questions. Who decides what the fund invests in? Isn't that a function of Congress? Shouldn't there be oversight? Shouldn't that be part of the appropriations process? Or are we really comfortable with the president just deciding where taxpayer dollars are going to be invested? Secondly, as you say, where's the money going to come from? Are we really going to raise taxes above current levels in order to fund a sovereign wealth fund to allow the president to invest in companies or entities that he decides without legislative authorization? I mean, that just seems very strange. And then, a third consideration, I think, is the same question I asked about nationalizing these companies. Why is this necessary? We have other tools that are much less intrusive. The government can enter into contracts with private companies. The government can guarantee purchases of goods and services from private companies. The government can subsidize some industries. The government can put tariffs on imports into other industries. I mean, why do we need a sovereign wealth fund when we have all these other tools? I think these are some of the questions to be asking.
Excellent. And in fact, we had just gotten that very question about like, what are the implications of sovereign wealth fund from our audience? Let me go to one of the other audience questions here. How do we strike the right balance between private enterprise and public intervention on critical technology developments with national security implications like AI?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and judgments have to be made. The CHIPS Act is a good example. That was a judgment call, and that attracted bipartisan support. I think precisely because it was a judgment call. I would kind of emphasize the importance of feasibility. And so if you look at the CHIPS Act, I think the optimistic projections were that the U.S. would be producing 30% of cutting edge chips. I think the Biden administration argued it was going to be probably closer to 20%. You know, is the U.S. more secure in a material sense, in a qualitative sense, producing 20% or 30% of cutting edge chips or not? In the event of a major war or some sort of major natural disaster, if 70 or 80% of those chips are produced overseas, is that closer to all the chips being produced overseas or not? That's an important question without an easy answer. And similarly with artificial intelligence, um, how much of that technological development, how much of the physical infrastructure required to power AI do we need to have in the United States from a security sense? Um, the answer isn't obvious, just like the answer with the CHIPS Act isn't obvious. And so, you have to make judgments, and that's why I think it's important for those sorts of policies to have bipartisan support, because you need to, it's easy in today's political environment to get your team on board with a policy, but if you could attract some members of the other team, that means your argument has some persuasive power. It means that your program is going to be durable. Um, the next president's less likely to just come into office and stomp all over it. One sign that you're making a good judgment is, I think, bipartisan support. The basic framework of the Biden administration, this small garden, high walls framework around certain key goods or key sectors, I think is the right way to think about it. But the big question is what goes in the small garden, and that's not easy to answer.
And where the burden of proof lies, right? I think you said something earlier, like the question of, well, why shouldn't we do it? Well, maybe the question should be that in a free enterprise, kind of free capitalist society, there's a pretty high burden of proof for the government to come intervening in that market. And there are going to be judgment calls about what clears that hurdle or not, but most things should never clear the hurdle.
Yeah.
It should be the exceptions rather than the rule.
Yeah, I totally.
We have a question here, I think that's really important, maybe from one of our small business owner members who's tuning in. How can the U.S. ensure that its industrial policies do not inadvertently stifle small businesses and startups, which are often key drivers of innovation? I wonder if you can comment on that. And also, I think we share the view that there's probably a difference between industrial policy picking winners and losers and the basic R&D research that lots of businesses and industries can then leverage in a competitive marketplace.
Yeah,
Discuss that difference too.
yeah. Let me start with the latter. And so I think government support for private sector R&D is just crucial, and it's one of the best things the government should be doing. You can argue that at least in the early months, the Trump administration has had an industrial policy of hurting our nation's ability to advance scientific discoveries and to advance innovation, which I think if that's sustained, it's going to be really, really, really detrimental. Tax policies that encourage and support private R&D expenditures, I think, are some of the best things that Congress can be doing to advance long-term prosperity. And so, absolutely, those are neutral policies. And so, you write that in a tax law, or fund the National Science Foundation, or whatever mechanism the government chooses to do. Pretty much any company or entity that qualifies can access those. And so I think that high level of neutrality really distinguishes those sorts of policies from industrial policy.
When you don't have that neutrality, it is actually hard to protect other businesses
Yes,
from becoming victims, right?
absolutely.
Even
Yeah.
when industrial policy done well, it does have downsides for people who aren't the beneficiaries of that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think the question talked about startups and talked about smaller businesses, and I don't really know a way around that. I mean, if the government is propping up big established leaders in a specific industry, that's going to make it harder for new entrants to break in. It's going to make it harder for small businesses to gain market share and to grow. And I think there's very little way around that. And as you say, Neil, even if the policy is successful, it's still going to have downsides, and that's going to be one of the downsides. And so I think that's just another reason to really use these tools sparingly and to make sure that they're used very, very judiciously. Because even in the best case scenario, there are still downsides to these policies. And it's those newer firms and those smaller firms. That's where a lot of our innovation comes from. That's where a lot of our employment growth comes from, even to broaden beyond just innovation. And so, the United States really should want to maintain that dynamism and that fluidity in our markets, because that's really key to long-term prosperity.
We have a perfect question here that might be a great kind of capstone from one of the audience members that I think actually will allow us to talk a little bit about where we see things driving industrial policy and why that's a bad idea. The questioner asks, how would you respond to those who support industrial policy as a mechanism for reshoring manufacturing jobs? Is there something to sacrificing some economic growth innovation to preserve opportunities for Americans?
Yeah, I'm not very sympathetic to the argument that we should be reshoring manufacturing jobs. And I'm not sympathetic to it for a few reasons. I think the first reason is that I just don't see it as feasible. The manufacturing employment is down to about 8% of overall employment. Probably half of those 8% are actually doing manufacturing. And that is a consequence, not so much of globalization and of offshoring. It's a consequence of technological advances. And manufacturing employment as a share of overall employment has been declining for decades. It was declining long before NAFTA. It was declining long before China acceded to the World Trade Organization. And so, we're not gonna roll back technological advances and tariffs and subsidies and those sorts of things. Unless we're taxing the use of robots, or we're taxing the use of new technology. I just don't think those sorts of efforts are going to be that effective. Secondly, we're already at a place in the United States where the average wage of a service sector worker is higher than the average wage of a manufacturing worker, and that's been true for almost a decade. So, if you want to boost manufacturing share of employment, what you're arguing for is shifting workers from higher wage occupations into lower wage occupations, and that seems like it would be the opposite of what we would want to do. If you're literally talking about bringing jobs back to the U.S. that have been offshored, then those jobs pay much lower wages than domestic manufacturing workers, who already themselves earn lower wages than domestic service sector workers. And so even if those jobs were brought back, it seems unlikely to me that in an economy with a 4% unemployment rate, you're going to find a lot of people who want to take them, because that would involve moving from a higher wage job into a lower wage job. So I have some very kind of foundational concerns about policy using that using reshoring or boosting manufacturing
It does
employment.
kind of hint to, not to hint, it's a direct, the government's decided what is a good job, right? The government's decided that we should all pay more for apparel because apparel jobs are good jobs and we should have more people in apparel making. Not to take anything away from apparel jobs, but right now the market's figuring that out. People are voting with where they decide to work, and the idea that government is going to manage that. I suspect when people were leaving kind of the farms in droves a century ago, there was a lot of people who romanticized farm and agricultural life in a way that said, gosh, we need to make sure that more people are staying, on the farm. Of course, when the government does that, that's taking away the choice that people have.
Yeah.
The government's putting the thumb on the scale rather than people making kind of free choices. And so it seems to me that when industrial policy is at its worst is when the government is making decisions about how all of us should kind of live and work and what our lives should be like, and rather than us making choices about what we do for a living and what we choose to buy and where we choose to spend our dollars.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and that should strike a negative note with us. I think for two reasons. The first is that in a free society, in a society that values individual liberty, that's not something we should want. We shouldn't want the government deciding what jobs are better than others. That we shouldn't want the government deciding what jobs we should take and what jobs we shouldn't take. Um, but the second reason is, I think, less abstract. It's that we are in a better position. Each individual, each worker, each business is in a much better position to know what is best and what is better for ourselves, for our companies, for our communities than the government is. And so, who do I trust knows better how to run a business? The owner or manager of that business, or somebody sitting behind a desk in Washington? Well, I go with the owner or manager of that business. Who do I think knows better how to plan my career, or how to plan your career, the career of a young worker? Um, Me, you, or that young worker, or somebody sitting behind a desk in Washington? I think we should trust people. We should trust businesses. Um, our greatness as a nation is because we have such great businesses, and we have workers who are motivated, and get up every day and work hard, and let's put our trust in them.
And that's at its core, that's the difference between free enterprise and a state planned economy. And industrial policy, to kind of end where we began, is kind of this fancy term for more state intervention and planning in the economy. And there may be some rare occasions where it makes sense, but most of the time it's pretty darn dangerous. I think that's a great place to leave it. Michael Strain, thank you so much for helping us kind of unpack this term, what it means, really understanding the good from the bad and kind of the implications of this. I want to thank everyone for joining us today on this free enterprise exchange. Thank you for submitting your questions. I would encourage everyone, if you haven't read it already, to get a copy of Michael Strain's book. The American Dream is not dead. That's the good news. The bad news is that populism could kill it. It is a wonderful expose on how much free enterprise has done and delivered for the prosperity of the American people. And it also refutes all the criticisms that you are most likely to hear online at a cocktail party about the problems of our economy, and one slim version. So pick it up, do yourself a favor, read that book. And Michael, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for your leadership, and thanks for all the chamber's doing.